Before we begin, a brief note for viewers who value careful historical analysis over speculation. What follows is not a sermon or a devotional reflection, but a disciplined examination of what ancient sources suggest happened after the death of Jesus of Nazareth, a period often compressed into a single sentence, yet filled with tension, silence, and unresolved questions. From the perspective of the Roman Empire, the execution of Jesus was unremarkable. Crucifixion was a standardized punishment, designed to crush resistance and erase memory. Thousands met the same fate along Roman roads, their deaths intended to end movements before they began. To Roman administrators in Judea, Jesus' death should have closed the matter. Yet Jerusalem did not return to normal. The execution took place on the eve of a major Jewish festival, when the city's population had swelled with pilgrims from across the region. Religious authorities were under pressure to maintain ritual purity, while Roman officials were focused on preventing unrest. The timing alone ensured that the death of Jesus unfolded under unusual social and political strain. Ancient sources indicate that his death created immediate complications. Jewish law required that bodies not remain exposed overnight, especially during sacred days. This necessity forced rapid decisions, involving figures who had previously remained in the background of the narrative. The burial of Jesus, carried out under time pressure and public visibility, would later become one of the most contested elements of the story. The canonical texts offer limited detail about the hours following the crucifixion. There is no extended description of mourning crowds or public speeches. Instead, the narrative contracts. Events are recorded briefly, almost abruptly, as if the authors themselves were aware of a pause, a moment where expectation and uncertainty replaced action. This narrative restraint has long intrigued historians. In ancient historical writing, silence is rarely accidental. What is not said can signal uncertainty, lost memory, or material deemed too complex for summary. The gap between Jesus' death and the first reports of an empty tomb became a focal point for later interpretation, debate, and expansion. Early Jewish and Greco-Roman audiences did not interpret death as an instantaneous end. The period immediately following death carried profound theological weight. Concepts of Sheol, the realm of the dead, and the fate of the righteous were actively debated during the Second Temple period. These beliefs shaped how early communities understood what it meant for Jesus to truly be dead. The disciples, according to the sources, did not emerge as confident witnesses in these hours. They disappear from the public scene. Fear, confusion, and disillusionment dominate the accounts. Expectations of divine intervention had collapsed with the body on the cross. What followed next would redefine those expectations entirely. But to understand how that transformation began, the burial itself, hurried, lawful, and closely observed, must be examined with precision. The burial of Jesus unfolded under constraints that were legal, cultural, and political. According to Jewish law of the period, a body left exposed after execution brought defilement upon the land, a concern heightened during major festivals. This requirement did not arise from compassion, but from covenantal obligation rooted in ancient legal tradition. Roman practice allowed families or benefactors to request the bodies of the executed, though such permissions were not automatic. In volatile provinces like Judea, Roman governors often balanced strict enforcement with pragmatic concessions. Granting burial could prevent unrest, especially when religious sensitivities were involved. Into this narrow window steps Joseph of Arimathea, described in the sources as a respected council member with social standing. His appearance is historically significant. Elite figures rarely associated themselves publicly with condemned criminals. Yet the burial narratives insist that this intervention occurred openly, not in secrecy. Archaeological evidence from first-century Judea confirms that crucifixion victims were sometimes buried, contrary to older assumptions that all were left to decay. Ossuaries, burial caves, and inscriptions demonstrate that Roman enforcement varied by region and circumstance. The burial of Jesus, therefore, was plausible within known historical patterns. Time was the dominant factor. With the Sabbath approaching, burial had to be completed quickly. There was no extended preparation, no elaborate mourning rites, and no public procession. The body was wrapped, placed in a rock-cut tomb, and sealed before nightfall. This haste would later fuel skepticism. A burial conducted under pressure leaves room for doubt. Questions of identification, placement, and oversight naturally arise. Ancient critics would later exploit these uncertainties, arguing confusion rather than miracle. Yet the same haste also meant that witnesses were present and alert, aware of where the body was laid. Women are repeatedly named among those observers. In a culture where female testimony held limited legal weight, their inclusion is striking. From a historiographical perspective, this detail is unlikely to be invented for persuasion. It suggests the preservation of memory rather than narrative convenience. The tomb itself reflects wealth and status. Rock-hewn tombs were not common graves. They were expensive and labor-intensive. This detail situates the burial within a specific social context, reinforcing the claim that the location was known and identifiable. Silence follows. After the burial, the sources describe withdrawal, not celebration. There is no expectation of reversal. The followers of Jesus do not prepare proclamations. They prepare for the Sabbath, observing the same laws that required the burial in the first place. This pause is critical. Movements centered on failed messianic figures typically dissolved after execution. History records many such cases. Followers return to obscurity or attach themselves to new leaders. Nothing in this moment suggests an exception. And yet, the burial, meant to conclude the story, becomes its most scrutinized turning point. What happens next does not occur in public squares or courts of law, but in absence, silence, and contested memory. Between the burial and the first claims of resurrection, the canonical narratives narrow almost to stillness. The texts do not describe visions, declarations, or secret meetings. Instead, they preserve a period of waiting shaped by ritual law, grief, and uncertainty. For historians, this restraint is as revealing as any dramatic event. In the literary culture of antiquity, authors rarely passed over important moments without reason. When they did, it often reflected uncertainty, fragmented memory, or reliance on traditions that resisted easy narration. The gap following Jesus' burial appears to belong to this category. It is a space where later interpretation would work hard to supply meaning. Second Temple Judaism held complex views of death. The dead were not imagined as immediately absent from reality, but as existing in a diminished state, awaiting judgment or restoration. Sheol, the realm of the dead, was understood as a place of silence rather than torment or reward. These ideas shaped how early Jewish followers processed the death of a teacher they believed had been chosen by God. Early Christian communities inherited this framework. They did not initially speak in the language of instantaneous triumph. Instead, they wrestled with categories already present in Jewish thought: righteous suffering, delayed vindication, and divine justice unfolding beyond human time. This helps explain why the earliest layers of tradition do not rush to fill the silence. The absence of action aligns with expectation. Death was final, at least temporarily. Hope, if it existed, had no clear form yet. Later apocryphal writings attempt to address this silence more directly. Texts circulating in the early centuries describe Jesus acting in the realm of the dead, proclaiming victory, or liberating the righteous of earlier generations. These narratives reflect theological development rather than eyewitness reporting, but they are valuable for understanding how communities tried to answer the same unresolved question: what happened when nothing seemed to happen? Such writings did not emerge in a vacuum. They drew on Hebrew poetic language, prophetic imagery, and ancient Near Eastern conceptions of the underworld. Similar motifs appear in Psalms, prophetic literature, and intertestamental texts that imagine divine figures descending into darkness and returning transformed. The canonical authors, however, resist elaboration. Their restraint suggests either limited knowledge or deliberate caution. From a historical standpoint, this makes the texts more credible, not less. They do not smooth over uncertainty, they preserve it. This period of silence also complicates later accusations of fabrication. Invented stories tend to fill gaps with spectacle. Here, the gap remains largely intact. The narrative tension is not resolved through description, but deferred to what follows. Meanwhile, the city of Jerusalem moved on. The festival continued. Pilgrims completed rituals and prepared to depart. Roman patrols maintained order. The execution of one Galilean teacher faded from administrative concern. For his followers, however, the silence carried a different weight. Without public leadership, without explanation, and without a clear future, the movement hovered on the edge of dissolution. Historically, this is the point at which similar movements ended. That this one did not is the central problem scholars must confront. And it begins not with proclamation, but with the endurance of silence itself. Among the earliest attempts to explain the silence after Jesus' death is a tradition that does not originate in the Gospels themselves, but in the broader theological world of early Judaism and Christianity. This tradition speaks not of inactivity, but of descent, the belief that Jesus entered the realm of the dead. While later creeds would formalize this idea, its roots are older and more complex. In Hebrew thought, the realm of the dead was not a place of moral sorting in the later Christian sense. Sheol was a condition of diminished existence, described through metaphors of shadow, stillness, and separation from the living. The righteous and the wicked alike were thought to descend there, awaiting divine action beyond human reach. Second Temple literature expanded on these ideas. Texts such as 1st Enoch and 4th Ezra reflect growing speculation about the fate of the dead, the vindication of the righteous, and divine intervention beyond history. These writings do not describe Jesus, but they establish a conceptual framework that made later interpretations possible. Early Christian authors inherited this framework and reinterpreted it. Several passages in the New Testament, written decades after the crucifixion, allude cautiously to activity beyond death. They do not describe scenes in detail, but they hint at proclamation, movement, and authority extending into death itself. These references are brief, ambiguous, and carefully worded. This restraint matters. If the earliest communities were attempting to persuade skeptics through spectacle, we would expect vivid descriptions and clear chronology. Instead, we find compressed language that assumes shared cultural understanding. The authors appear more concerned with theological coherence than narrative expansion. Later apocryphal texts, written as Christian theology matured, supply what the earlier sources do not. They describe Jesus confronting death, addressing imprisoned spirits, or liberating the righteous figures of Israel's past. These accounts are not treated by historians as eyewitness history, but as theological reflection shaped by scripture and liturgy, yet their existence is significant. They demonstrate that early communities felt the need to explain the interval between death and resurrection. The silence was not ignored, it was wrestled with. The descent tradition functioned as an answer to a pressing question. If Jesus was truly victorious, where did that victory begin? From a historical perspective, this tradition reflects continuity rather than invention. It draws from established Jewish concepts rather than introducing foreign mythology. There is no borrowing from pagan underworld epics. The language remains restrained, moral, and rooted in biblical imagination. Still, scholars remain divided. Some view these traditions as symbolic language, expressing theological claims about death's defeat rather than literal events. Others argue that they preserve fragments of early belief, later overshadowed by resurrection-focused narratives. What is clear is that the descent motif did not emerge suddenly. It developed gradually within a recognizable intellectual world. Meanwhile, the earliest gospel narratives remain focused on what can be located in time and place. They return not to the underworld, but to the city, the tomb, and the witnesses. Whatever meaning was later assigned to the silence, the historical record pivots back to the material world. The next development does not unfold in visionary literature or theological speculation, but in reports tied to geography, social memory, and physical absence. It begins not with a declaration, but with a disturbance, reported in language drawn from prophecy, ritual, and crisis. The first disruptions reported after Jesus' death are not centered on people, but on the world itself. Early sources describe physical and ritual disturbances using language deeply rooted in Hebrew scripture. These are not random details. They echo established patterns used to mark moments of divine judgment or transition. One of the most discussed elements is the tearing of the temple veil. In the Jerusalem temple, this curtain separated the inner sanctuary from the rest of the sacred space. It symbolized restricted access to the divine presence, regulated by priesthood and ritual law. The report of its tearing is brief, yet theologically charged, suggesting a rupture in the established religious order. Historians debate how this claim should be understood. Some view it as symbolic language, drawing on prophetic imagery to express a theological conclusion rather than a physical event. Others argue that a remembered incident, later interpreted through Scripture, may lie behind the account. What matters historically is not proving the mechanism, but recognizing the meaning the authors intended to convey to their audience. Natural phenomena are also mentioned. Darkness during daylight hours appears in several ancient texts describing moments of crisis. Similar language occurs in prophetic writings to signal upheaval, divine displeasure, or the end of an era. Whether this reflects an actual environmental event or a literary convention remains contested, but its inclusion follows a recognizable pattern. The report of tombs opening and the dead appearing in the city stands apart as the most debated element. It appears in only one canonical source and is described without elaboration or follow-up. Ancient historians note that singular reports like this often function as theological signposts rather than developed narratives. The absence of names, locations, or later references suggests restraint rather than embellishment. From a literary perspective, these events frame Jesus' death not as an isolated execution, but as a moment of cosmic consequence. The language connects his death to Israel's prophetic tradition, positioning it within a broader story of judgment and renewal. Importantly, these disturbances do not produce immediate clarity. No mass repentance follows. No public declaration resolves the crisis. The city continues its routines. Temple operations resume. Roman authority remains intact. This detail is critical. If the authors were constructing a triumphant myth, the aftermath would likely show immediate transformation. Instead, the narrative presents disruption without resolution. Signs appear, but meaning remains unclear. The world reacts, but does not yet change. For historians, this pattern aligns with remembered crisis, rather than staged spectacle. Real events often leave confusion before interpretation solidifies. Meaning is assigned later, once outcomes become visible. In the days following these disturbances, attention shifts away from cosmic signs and back to human response. Decisions made by authorities, driven by fear and calculation, begin to shape what survives in memory and what is suppressed. The consequences of Jesus' death are no longer confined to symbolism. They enter the realm of policy, rumor, and control, where history leaves clearer traces. In the days following the execution and burial of Jesus, concern shifted from ritual obligation to damage control. Religious authorities in Jerusalem were not facing a theological puzzle, but a practical one. A public execution had occurred during a volatile festival period, and the potential for unrest had not disappeared with the body in the tomb. The sources suggest a climate of anxiety rather than triumph. The removal of Jesus eliminated a disruptive figure, but it did not erase his influence. Teachings delivered publicly, confrontations remembered by crowds, and the symbolic charge of the execution itself all remained active in the city's collective memory. Roman administration approached such situations with caution. Judea was a province with a long record of unrest, and Roman governors were less concerned with theology than with stability. Any movement capable of reigniting public emotion, even after the death of its leader, was treated as a potential threat. This context helps explain actions attributed to the authorities regarding the tomb. Requests for security, concern over rumors, and preventative measures reflect a mindset shaped by political calculation, not superstition. From a historical perspective, such responses are consistent with Roman practices elsewhere in the empire. The idea that followers might manipulate the narrative was not implausible in the ancient world. Competing claims about prophets, healers, and messianic figures were common. Disputes over bodies, relics, and burial sites appear in multiple ancient sources. The concern was not what had happened, but what might be claimed next. At the same time, The followers of Jesus do not appear to be organizing or preparing a public response. The texts portray them as scattered and silent. There is no indication of coordinated planning, no attempt to seize the narrative in these early days. This asymmetry between institutional concern and follower inactivity is historically notable. Fear operates on both sides. Authorities fear instability and loss of control. Followers fear association, arrest, or worse. In this environment, even small actions carry weight. A guarded tomb, an official explanation, or a circulating rumor could shape how the story would later be remembered. Ancient polemical traditions preserve traces of these early explanations. Competing accounts emerge not as neutral observations, but as responses to an already disputed memory. This suggests that the meaning of Jesus' death was contested almost immediately, not gradually, over generations. Jerusalem itself becomes a character in this moment. A city layered with sacred history, political tension, and crowded streets, it absorbs the event without resolving it. Life continues outwardly, but beneath the surface, interpretations begin to diverge. What follows next does not originate from authorities or institutions. It comes from the margins of society, from individuals whose testimony carried little formal weight, yet whose presence at critical moments is consistently preserved. Their role will complicate assumptions about authorship, credibility, and the mechanics of early memory. When the narrative resumes, it does so through voices that ancient audiences would not have expected to carry authority. The earliest witnesses named in the resurrection accounts are women, figures positioned at the margins of legal and social power in the first-century Mediterranean world. From a historical standpoint, this detail is one of the most difficult to dismiss. In Jewish and Greco-Roman legal culture, female testimony was often regarded as secondary or inadmissible in formal proceedings. Authors attempting to construct a persuasive public fiction would have had little incentive to place women at the center of such a claim. Yet the sources consistently do so, across multiple traditions that do not otherwise agree on details. These women are not portrayed as confident heralds. They arrive at the tomb expecting death to remain final. Their actions align with burial customs, not anticipation of reversal. This expectation matters. It suggests that the resurrection claim did not arise from prior belief, but from confrontation with something unexpected. The reports describe absence rather than presence. The tomb is found empty, not illuminated by spectacle. There is no description of resurrection itself, no moment of transition, no witnesses to the act. Ancient historians note that this restraint runs counter to myth-making tendencies, which favor visible transformation and dramatic proof. Interpretation follows confusion. The initial response is fear, uncertainty, and hesitation. Some accounts describe silence, others describe fragmented reporting. This lack of immediate coherence reflects how real events are often processed before narrative stabilization occurs. Memory forms unevenly, shaped by shock rather than intention. The presence of messengers, described variously as angels or young men, is framed in language consistent with biblical theophanies. They do not provide new doctrine. They interpret what has already occurred. Their role is explanatory, not performative. This distinction aligns with earlier scriptural patterns, where divine messengers clarify events rather than enact them. From a historical perspective, the empty tomb alone does not prove resurrection. Ancient critics recognized this and offered alternative explanations. What it does establish is a shared point of reference. Something about the burial site did not match expectation, and that discrepancy demanded explanation. Equally significant is where these reports originate. They are tied to specific locations, times of day, and identifiable practices. This grounding in place contrasts with visionary traditions that unfold outside historical settings. Whatever meaning was later attached to the event, the memory itself is anchored in geography. The involvement of women also complicates later attempts at suppression. Testimony circulating informally, beyond institutional control, is difficult to manage. Stories carried through households and social networks resist official framing. This may explain why alternative explanations appear so early in surviving polemical sources. The narrative is now in motion again. But movement does not yet mean understanding. The empty tomb creates a question, not a conclusion. The claim that follows will not be shaped in isolation, but forged through conflict, between memory and authority, experience and explanation. The next stage of the story reveals how quickly those explanations multiplied and how sharply they collided. As reports of the empty tomb circulated, explanations emerged almost immediately. These were not later inventions imposed from a distance, but responses formed within the same cultural and historical moment. The speed with which alternative accounts appear suggests that the claim was public, specific, and difficult to ignore. One explanation focused on human agency. The idea that the body had been removed by followers, sympathizers, or unknown parties, aligned with common ancient assumptions. Tomb violations were not unheard of, and disputes over burial sites appear in legal and literary sources across the Roman world. This explanation required no supernatural claims, only motive and opportunity. Another line of interpretation framed the experiences of Jesus' followers as visionary rather than historical. Ancient audiences were familiar with dreams, apparitions, and post-mortem encounters, especially in periods of grief. Philosophers and physicians of the era discussed how intense emotional states could produce vivid experiences without physical cause. These explanations were not neutral. They functioned as counter-narratives, aimed at stabilizing public order and preserving existing authority structures. By offering alternatives, institutions could acknowledge the reports without accepting their implications. What is striking is that none of the surviving explanations deny that the tomb was empty. The debate centers on why, not whether. This shared premise indicates that the location of the burial was known and accessible to multiple parties. A claim tied to a verifiable site invites refutation, not abstraction. Jewish polemical traditions preserved in later texts reflect this early controversy. They do not attempt to erase the story, but to reframe it. The resurrection claim is treated as a problem to be managed, not a rumor to be dismissed. This tone implies that the movement had already gained visibility. Roman sources are more distant, but their silence is also telling. Executed criminals rarely generated sustained discussion unless their followers persisted. The continued presence of competing explanations suggests that the issue did not fade quickly. From a historiographical perspective, the existence of multiple early explanations strengthens, rather than weakens, the historical core of the event. Competing accounts typically arise when something resists easy resolution. If the claim had been easily disproven, debate would have ended early. Instead, the explanations multiply. Each attempts to account for the same set of facts: an executed teacher, a known tomb, followers claiming something unexpected, and authorities responding defensively. The disagreement is not over details at the margins, but over the meaning of a shared disruption. What remains to be explained is not the tomb, but the people. Within a remarkably short time, the followers of Jesus move from fear to proclamation. This transformation demands historical scrutiny because it occurs under conditions that should have prevented it. The next stage of the story shifts away from sites and explanations and toward human behavior, where history leaves some of its clearest traces. The most consequential development after Jesus' death is not found in the tomb, but in the behavior of his followers. Ancient sources portray a group that had every reason to disappear. Their leader had been executed publicly, their expectations shattered, and their association with him potentially dangerous. History offers many parallels where such movements dissolved quickly and permanently, yet this one did not. Within a short span of time, the same individuals described earlier as fearful and withdrawn begin to speak publicly and consistently. They do so in the same city where the execution occurred, not at a safe distance. This geographical proximity matters. Proclamation in Jerusalem exposed the claims to immediate challenge, verification, or suppression. Historians approach this transformation cautiously. Sudden shifts in group behavior can result from many factors: charismatic replacement leaders, reinterpretation of failure, or gradual myth-making. But the sources resist these explanations. No new leader replaces Jesus. No revised teaching softens the impact of his death. The message centers on the execution itself, now reinterpreted rather than avoided. Equally significant is the cost. Public association with an executed figure carried social and legal risk. Arrests, interrogations, and marginalization are not later inventions. They appear early and persistently in the record. Movements built on deliberate deception tend to fracture under pressure. Here, cohesion increases. Psychological explanations alone also struggle to account for the breadth of the transformation. Collective grief can produce visions, but it rarely produces sustained, organized public action across multiple communities. Nor does it typically lead individuals to accept hardship without tangible benefit. From a historical standpoint, the transformation of the disciples does not prove the truth of their claims, but it does demand explanation. Something occurred that reoriented their understanding of reality strongly enough to overcome fear, loss, and social consequence. Importantly, this transformation is not described as instantaneous clarity. The sources preserve hesitation, doubt, and misunderstanding even after the first proclamations. Belief develops unevenly. This gradual consolidation aligns with real historical processes rather than polished legend. As the movement expands beyond Jerusalem, its core claim remains consistent while interpretations diversify. This pattern suggests an originating event that was stable enough to anchor identity, yet complex enough to invite reflection. For historians, this behavioral shift is one of the strongest data points available. Beliefs can be invented, texts can be edited, but sustained, costly behavior across time and geography is harder to fabricate. The final question, then, is not whether early Christians believed something happened. It is what history can responsibly say about what actually did, and where the limits of historical method must be acknowledged. That boundary defines the final stage of the inquiry. When historians gather all available evidence, a boundary emerges, not between belief and disbelief, but between what history can affirm and what it cannot adjudicate. The death of Jesus is among the best attested executions of antiquity. His burial, the discovery of an empty tomb, and the rapid emergence of resurrection claims belong to the same early historical horizon. These elements are not late additions. They appear at the foundation of the tradition. What history cannot do is recreate the event itself. No ancient source claims to witness the moment of resurrection. There is no description of mechanism, no physical narrative of transition. This absence is not a weakness in the record, but a defining feature of it. The earliest authors do not attempt to cross that line. Instead, they document consequences. They record disruption where closure should have occurred. They preserve disagreement rather than unanimity. They name witnesses whose credibility would not have strengthened a fabricated account. They acknowledge fear, doubt, and competing explanations without resolving every tension. In doing so, they leave a record that behaves more like history than legend. From a strictly historical perspective, several conclusions can be stated with confidence. Jesus of Nazareth was executed by Roman authority. He was buried in a known location. Shortly thereafter, that burial site became the center of controversy. His followers, initially defeated, became convinced that death had not ended his role or authority. This conviction emerged early, publicly, and at significant personal cost. No alternative explanation fully accounts for all of these data points without creating new problems of its own. Theft does not explain transformation. Vision alone does not explain consistency. Suppression does not explain survival. Each proposal resolves one question by intensifying another. History therefore reaches its limit not in silence, but in convergence. Multiple independent strands, textual, cultural, behavioral, point toward an event that was experienced as real, disruptive, and decisive by those closest to it. Whether that event is interpreted as resurrection depends on assumptions that extend beyond historical method, but that the aftermath of Jesus' death altered the course of individuals, communities, and eventually civilizations is not in doubt. The question, then, is not whether something happened after Jesus died. It is why that something refused to stay buried, in memory, in testimony, or in history itself. At that point, the historian can document the impact, trace the arguments, and map the consequences. The final interpretation belongs not to myth or dismissal, but to the reader standing at the same crossroads that first-century Jerusalem could not avoid.